Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux, had he considered using C++ in the construction and evolution of the Linux kernel? And he said he had considered it, and I don't recall if he's done extensive tests with C++, but his ultimate conclusion was that C++ would not be the right way to go to build Linux. Now, there may have been some people at that time that would have considered Linus's take as a rejection of other languages. And as you know now, Linux has a growing amount of code that is written in the Rust programming language. And of course, there is some tensions at times between those that write code in Rust and those that write code in C or C++. Now, here's the thing. Linus Torvalds embraces Rust with open arms. But the version of Linus Torvalds that has done that is quite different than the one that initiated Linux all those decades ago. So, if I remember correctly, because I'm not at a computer, but I think Linux is about 40 years old, maybe. But that's a good run for a computer operating system. But the thing about it is, I've wondered with the recent rise and surge of Rust in the Linux kernel, why wouldn't there have been a reconsideration of C++ in Linux kernel development to the extent that we're seeing with Rust? Right? And maybe there's a good justification for that. I could probably come up with some off the top of my head. There's one I can think of. One would be binary compatibility. That has been a criticism of C++. I'm sure there would have been ways to work around that with all the experts in the Linux world, right? At some point, they could have even made their own version of C++. But anyway, Rust has some of the features of C++, and I would say features that I think Linus Torvalds rejected. But now that Rust is acceptable, right? I'm like, what was the big deal? But the real reason I bring this up in terms of Rust and C++ and the relevance to the Linux kernel is that C++ has evolved quite a ways since the time that Linus Torvalds decided to reject C++, or at least not favor it for Linux kernel development. At this time, we're at C++ 26, right? And when I started adopting C++ myself back in 2012, C++ 11 had just came out. And so I was fortunate when I adopted C++ that I got the better version of C++. So my point of view is somewhat tailored to that experience. I adopted C++ right at the time where it was coming out of a long dormant state of growth and into this new era where it was taking on new capabilities, new concepts, no pun intended for the C++ faithful. But It was adopting better practices and better ways to write and structure code. And it was absolutely remarkable what you could do with C++, even with someone coming into it with a background heavy in C#. Granted, many of the concepts that C++ 11 and later C++ 14 would adopt, I wouldn't say was influenced by languages like C# and Java, but there was a strong correlation. So you have features in C and C++ today that were well established in C# and Java for a good while. But that being said, C++ still had the advantage of giving you higher performance, more intricate code that could tap into the hardware, but at the same time be very high level and allow you to be very productive. And although I am proficient in pointers and pointer manipulation, I followed the guidelines in avoiding that to the extent possible. So I learned, well, there wasn't actually any books that showed you how to do this, but I figured out how to write C++ code in such a way where you could use just straight references or use local scopes and not need any pointers, or greatly reduce it at the application level. So that's all good and dandy for me, but I'm not sure that those practices would work in Linux kernel development. But I still wonder what it would be like if the Linux kernel community had adopted something like C++ 26 instead of Rust, right? And would that have been a more streamlined transition than attempting to rewrite software in Rust, where you may acquire more bugs, more flaws, more defects, more unknown edge cases than you would be able to prove with C++ because of C++'s proximity to the C programming language that the Linux kernel has predominantly been based on. So anyway, I was just curious about that, and that's my take.